We are privileged to have with us as our plenary speaker, Professor Arvind Sharma, who is internationally known in several areas. He is the Burks Professor of Comparative Religion at McGill University. His works focus on comparative religion, Hinduism, and the role of women in religion. There is so much I could say about Professor Sharma that it would probably take up his whole time, so I would rather let him tell you his own presentation instead. But there's a couple of things I do want to mention. One of the things that I think he may not have a chance to touch on today, I hope he does, is the concept of reciprocal illumination. It's a concept that he has developed, which is really quite brilliant. The term is there in biology, but it has a different implication. He uses it to mean the cross-fertilization between religions that can and does happen, properly acknowledged, and also he uses it very much in a very, very specific way to mean how the learning of a particular religious tradition, other than the one is studying, let's say, can illuminate factors within that tradition that one is looking at. So in other words, it's a hermeneutical lens. And it doesn't have to be religion alone. It can be other modes of knowledge, other epistemological tools. I hope he has a chance to touch on it because it's relevant to everything we do at this conference. He has written nearly about 100 books. We have all lost count. In fact, I think he has lost count. He's brought the world religions together in several global conferences, particularly the world religions after 9/11, very well-known Congress of the world's religions. And he has put together numerous edited volumes on ethics, on women, on a large number of topics from the perspectives of different religious traditions. One of his best-known books is called Our Religions, and it's by scholar practitioners of every major religious tradition talking about their faith tradition, both from a scholarly perspective and their own perspective. It is my honor and pleasure to invite Professor Sharma. Please welcome him.
Thank you, Rita, for those generous words of introduction. As I begin to speak, I find myself laboring under several disadvantages. I am billed to lecture on the topic, what is Hinduism after Vivekananda? And now I am sure you will agree that Vivekananda is a tough act to follow, especially after 150 years. As I look around, I find myself surrounded by learned scholars on every side. So you will forgive me for feeling a little intimidated, somewhat like the proverbial Daniel in the lion's den. And a friend pointed out to me, when I told her that I am supposed to give this talk, that I am triply damned as I start to speak on Hinduism. First of all, I am supposed to be a Hindu, although no such thing as Hinduism, I am assured, exists. Then I am supposed to be a Brahmin, although according to the Matsya Puran, all human beings in the Kali Yuga are Shudras. And finally, I was once upon a time the assistant collector of Godhra. So the notorious disturbances of 2002 can be explained by astute historians as the inevitable long-term consequence of my maladministration. So, those looking for a scapegoat for the Godhra riots can always blame me for it. Laboring under these disadvantages as I am, I claim your indulgence as I try to do my best. So what is Hinduism? Now the title for today's presentation is What is Hinduism? And its subtitle, if I may add one, is Let Me Count the Ways. Now let me share a secret with you. When I started counting these ways, I began to get confused, justifying at least one definition of Hinduism, offered, I hope, tongue-in-cheek, that Hinduism is a confused state of mind. I then exclaimed, twice in frustration. The first exclamation went, what is Hinduism all about? And the second, what is Hinduism after all? And these two could serve as two optional titles for today's talk. You will notice that although these two titles cover more or less the same ground, the latter title, What is Hinduism after all, has a slight emotional edge to it. What is Hinduism after all? It conveys just a hint of frustration with all the fuss about defining Hinduism, which has led some to propose defining Hinduism as indefinable. A touch of mysticism there at the one end, and is leading to the conclusion that there is no such thing as Hinduism, because no such thing can be defined on the other, and a touch of skepticism there. This last view reflects a confusion between the definition and the thing, which the definition sets out to define. A thing may be difficult to define, but that need not mean that the thing does not exist. It may only be just that, something difficult to define. Let me now move to the more cerebral version of the title, namely, what is Hinduism all about? What it is all about may well provide a clue as to why it is so hard to pin down, as it were. In fact, another title of the talk could be The Horizon of Hinduism. You may find some justification for this as I proceed. At this point, I would only draw your attention to a peculiar feature of the horizon. The horizon surrounds us as the background and the content within which all particular events occur. Yet, we never directly touch the horizon. Hinduism does seem to share this elusive quality. I wish to start out by claiming that I am going to address the topic today without presuppositions. And what I mean by saying that is that I shall not discuss what people have said Hinduism is all about. I will just try to tell you what it seems to me to be all about. Similarly, I do not presuppose any existing knowledge of the details of Hinduism on the part of the audience, only a wish to understand what it might be. I will now like to make a very general statement that it is difficult to define any religious tradition, not just Hinduism. And this for at least two reasons. The first is that every tradition possesses a quality which exceeds its contents. Every tradition possesses a quality which exceeds its contents. This is a statement I felt is so important that I repeated it, but do consider this for a while. Were a tradition exhausted by its existing contents, no change within it would be possible. But all traditions change over time. All traditions have changed over time. Of course, change can go in two directions. It could be for better or for worse, unless the change makes no difference, a possible but unlikely outcome. So change can be for better or for worse. When it is for better, we call it progress. And when it is for worse, we call it decline or regress. But whether it is for better or for worse, it carries the implication that each religious tradition possesses within it an unexhausted potential, in the absence of which no change would be possible. Or to put the matter less philosophically and more directly, religious traditions are not static. And this fact implies that a tradition possesses a quality which exceeds its contents, and this is true of every living tradition. One tends to miss this point as religious traditions often present themselves as a complete whole to us. I do not wish to deny that they may also be open to further development, hence open and yet complete, and thus complete without being exhausted. I would like to reiterate that this holds true of all religious traditions and, of course, Hinduism. That Hinduism also contains a quality which is not exhausted by its contents, as found in the past or in the present. This then is characteristic of all traditions when viewed in terms of time. When viewed in terms of space, they again reveal a similar and shared feature, that they are characterized by internal diversity. Even the most formally definable religion, which is how some might want to characterize Islam, displays enormous internal diversity. I include here both the formal and informal diversity which characterizes major world religions. Since I invoked Islam, let me stay with this example. Islam recognizes a major division within itself between the Sunnis and the Shiis, and also 4 and even 5 major schools of the Sharia or Islamic law, and so on. And yet beyond that, scholars and general observers alike have noticed the difference, if not formally, then in the texture and tone, should I say inflection, of the religion as it is practiced in Saudi Arabia, Iran, Pakistan, India, Bangladesh, Indonesia, and here in the West. Similarly, Christianity recognizes 3 basic subdivisions within itself: the Catholic, the Protestant, and the Eastern Orthodox. Just to give you an idea of how major these differences within a tradition can be, let me share with you the fact that in Indonesia, Catholicism and Protestantism are treated as separate religions. The same is the case with China. Both the Chinese and the Indonesian governments treat them as 2 distinct religions, as also some websites dealing with religion. The point cuts deeper than may be apparent at first sight. Sociologists have also argued that people within the same tradition, the same religious tradition, may have different perspectives on it. Thus, even within Protestantism, an Episcopalian may have a different perspective on it than a Baptist. Lest this point appear remote, consider this. The inability to find a place at the inn in Bethlehem by the parents of Jesus may possess a somewhat different, and dare I say, deeper meaning for a black Christian inured to such an experience in a white society than for a white Christian, although both may be participating in the same depiction of the Nativity. In plain words, then, not only are religious traditions not static, they are also not monolithic, and for similar reasons. Not only does a tradition possess a quality which exceeds its content, it also possesses horizons of meaning which exceed its visible content. Now, at this point, I can see you getting somewhat restless. You did not come here to hear a lecture on comparative religion. You came here to hear a lecture on Hinduism, and more precisely on what it might be. Let me then share with you the adage current in the study of religion, which might palliate us somewhat, that Hinduism is to India what comparative religion is to the world. Hinduism is to India what comparative religion is to the world. This is, of course, a proposition pregnant with many meanings, but the interpretation I would like to draw from it at the moment is this: that these descriptions of all religions, that they are not static and not monolithic, apply to Hinduism with special force. There is a marked difference of degree. Both are present in what we refer to usually as Hinduism to a much greater degree than in other religions. In fact, let me alert you that in the end I'll be claiming that this difference in degree leads to a difference in kind. Hinduism is in a class by itself. It is not, it is one of the principles of Marxist thought that a change in quantity ultimately leads to a change in quality. If you apply a certain quantity of heat to water to make it boil, then if you go on raising the temperature, water eventually evaporates. Change in quantity, heat has led to change in quality. From liquid it has become vapor. This is how a change in quantity can lead to a change in quality. It is also inherent in the phenomenological claim that the scale creates the phenomena. But I digress. Thus, Hinduism is not static, just as no religious tradition is static. Let me now celebrate, having trouble reading my own writing, Let me elaborate on how this point applies to Hinduism with greater force than to many other religions. Most of the religions of the world have an identifiable founder or founders. This is not the case with Hinduism. Its origins, to use an expression so loved by the authors of textbooks on it, its origins are shrouded in the mist of antiquity. Thus, while in the case of other religions, we may be able to establish a determinate point when they came into being and then began to change, such a point seems to elude us in the case of Hinduism. In fact, that it is called Sanatan Dharma in India seems to confirm this. The word Sanatana means eternal, but it can also mean immemorial. But on either reading, the origins of Hinduism remain shrouded in mist or mystery. Even if one insists that Hinduism starts with the Vedas, such a point, though now definite, yet remains undetermined. Even according to this view, we do not know when they came into being, only when they had come into being. That is around 1200 BCE, according to modern scholarship. Moreover, according to the Hindu tradition itself, the origin of the Vedas remains cosmologically indeterminate, nitya and apaurushaya. Hinduism is not monolithic either. Its social and sectarian divisions border on the scandalous. Allow me to illustrate this point with an anecdote. Not because I wish to use an anecdote as a substitute for analysis, but to lighten the burden of our theme. It is said that once a Muslim got trapped on the wrong side of the religious divide during a day of communal tension in Banaras, or Varanasi, as it is now called. Finding himself trapped among the Hindus, he found it prudent to pass himself off as one. But the crowd which hemmed him in had its doubts, so it began to interrogate him. Are you a Hindu or a Muslim? He was asked. I am a Hindu, he replied. Which Hindu? They asked again. He paused for a moment and then said, a Brahman. I have just taken my holy bath in the Ganges. But the crowd was not impressed. Which Brahman? They demanded to know. He paused again, but still had his wits about him, although a bit shaken. God Brahman. God Brahman, he replied with satisfaction. God Brahman, as you might well know, constitute a well-known subdivision of Brahmins. Which God? Came the next question. At this point, the poor fellow gave up. He could not negotiate the internal divisions of the Hindu community any further and exclaimed, Ya Allah. There are even further subdivisions among them. And of course, each subdivision has its own perspective on the tradition. Let me now pause to take stock of the argument so far. We have argued that no religious tradition is static or monolithic. In other words, that it is characterized by historical transformation and internal diversity. We have further argued that these features get particularly accentuated when we come to Hinduism. But where does this leave us? Have we not drifted away from the main theme and gone off on a perhaps interesting but otherwise useless and even misleading excursion from the main theme? I would now like to make 3 points, which I hope will demonstrate that the exercise we just carried out may not have been in vain. The fact that religions are neither monolithic nor static makes it harder to arrive at a definition of any religious tradition than would otherwise be the case. So my first point, it is this fact about a religious tradition which, even in the case of such a self-conscious tradition as Islam, poses problems, as in the case of the Ahmadiyyas, for instance. If this was the first point, then the second one is going to be, while in the case of religions which possess a conscious self-definition, such as the Shahada in Islam or the three refuges in Buddhism, these differences arise in spite of their firm self-definition. In Hinduism, these differences arise on account of what Hinduism sets out to be, and not in spite of it. A point to be elaborated further. The third point comes into focus if we ask the fundamental question, why do historical change and internal diversity pose problems for defining a tradition? They pose problems because the definition has to have a unity to it. It is meant to unify the diverse elements contained in what is to be defined in some way, so that the greater the measure of change and diversity, the more formidable the challenge it poses to such a unitary statement presupposed by a definition. Now we can see how the problem of defining any religion helps us to clarify the difficulty in defining Hinduism and why it is so difficult to define Hinduism. It is difficult to define because it is non-exclusive. A definition requires delimitation and exclusion. To define something as something means that it must be other than something else, or not be something else. Hinduism, however, typically feels unhappy in such situations. Allow me to share with you 3 displays of such non-exclusiveness from within it. The late Swami Chandrasekhar Bharati of Sringeri, of the Sringeri Peeth, was approached by a Christian in 1953 with a request that the Swami allow him to convert to Hinduism. The Swami asked him, "Have you tried Christianity?" Second example, an example of the secular uses of the Hindu religious non-exclusiveness, which comes from a statement made by Pandit Jawaharlal Nehru. When John Foster Dulles, the US Secretary of State at the time, asked him, "Are you for us or against us?" A very American question, you will grant. Are you for us or against us? Pandit Nehru replied, "Yes." Those things we approve of, we are with you, those things. When Rabbi Richard Rubinstein began feeling confined and uncomfortable by what he had come to think was a narrow interpretation of Jewish identity, in which he had been nurtured, he sought solace from his wife, who knew somebody at the university with whom she shared their concern, who happened to be an Indian. And she said, "You know, the Swamis have a way of dealing with this. So perhaps you should arrange a meeting between Richard Rubinstein and Swami Muktanand to clarify the situation." No sooner had Swami Muktanand met Rabbi Rubinstein that he told him, "I hope you don't believe in your religion. I don't believe in mine." I would not like to revert to the 3 points mentioned earlier. The first was that the problem of defining any religious tradition may shed light on the case of Hinduism. And it does, I would like to claim. These problems arise because no religious tradition is static or monolithic. But Hinduism, on account of being non-exclusive, does not feel the need to somehow control or contain its historical development and internal diversity, because the tradition itself consists of these features as they manifest themselves. It is not concerned so much with maintaining the boundaries of these phenomena as they manifest themselves, as with the phenomena themselves. The second point related to the question whether differences are seen as arising out of a self-definition or in spite of it. One could now argue that these differences are part of Hinduism on account of what it sets out to be. I am distinguishing here between the Hindu community as such, and Hinduism as the totality of the beliefs and practices of this community. Just as one might distinguish a tree as a concept from an actual tree standing in the garden. The idea is that this totality can exceed what this community believes because of the options entertained by people. The clarifying question to ask is, what is this underlying concept of Hinduism all about? When we ask what Hinduism is all about. And my conclusion is that the following concept underlies the phenomenon which the term Hinduism refers to. Hinduism as a religion derives its rationale, its justification, from trying to afford to every Hindu the maximum access to all the beliefs and practices of the globe, from which a Hindu might potentially benefit. This is what Hinduism is all about. I would like to emphasize that the word all, and further that this all applies to both beliefs and practices all over the globe. Notice though that beliefs are more easily assimilated than practices, and that practices are more easily assimilated than communities. Why? Because ideas cannot be confined. They belong to mental consciousness, which is subtle, while practices often have an embodied character and involve a physical consciousness immediately less accessible than the mental. As a Hindu, I may accept Jesus as the Savior right away. But as a vegetarian and a teetotaler Hindu, or anyone who is a vegetarian and a teetotaler Hindu, may take some time getting used to the talk of bread and wine at the Eucharist. That is why the assimilation of practices may lag behind that of beliefs in Hinduism's comprehensive agenda. And the assimilation of communities may lag behind both the assimilation of beliefs and practices. The case of the goddess Chandi may provide an interesting example here. The fierce Chandi had already been absorbed into the Hindu pantheon by the early years of the Christian era. But the ritual practices involving blood and meat took longer. And Hinduism is still having difficulty absorbing its fierce worshippers, the Chandals, it seems, at the moment, who are in the process of being absorbed. But Hinduism's goal may be even more all-embracing than what I proposed originally. It may want to render accessible, and here Vivekananda comes in, it may want to render accessible all the beliefs and practices which might be of use and may, and it may want to render all of them accessible to all people, not just the Hindu community. Just as it wants to do it to the Hindu community. But obviously, those who want to exclude themselves from the Hindu community cannot be forced to belong to it. Thus, its non-exclusive thrust is most obvious in the realm of ideas and doctrines, less so in that of practices, and the least in the case of communities. But these differences represent different manifestations or different rates of absorption of the same in the same underlying process. This brings us to the third point mentioned earlier. Why should historical change and internal variety pose a challenge to the self-definition of a religious tradition? They pose a challenge because religious traditions typically define themselves in terms of externalizing criteria or externalized criteria or criterion under which they stand, and therefore they are easier to understand. But Hinduism freely defines itself in terms of these changes and such diversities. Mind you, it does face the challenge of managing these changes and diversities. And the problems of managing these changes and diversities are formidable. But this issue of management must be kept distinct from Hinduism's prior self-definition in terms of the accumulation, perhaps the global accumulation of these changes and differences, thus justifying its self-description as the cumulative tradition, another connotation of the word Sanatana. The objection may be raised at this point that even though the attempt to define Hinduism in terms of non-exclusivity may be voracious, but is not vacuous, nevertheless, such a mode of definition remains negative in character, inasmuch as it tells us what Hinduism does not do, is loath to do, namely, exclude. It does not tell us what it likes to do and why. Moreover, it assumes that there is already a Hindu community in existence which does not exclude others. Others, of course, may exclude themselves from it. Even elements once deemed part of it may begin to exclude themselves from it. Raja Ranjit Singh, the famous Sikh king of Punjab, for instance, attended the Kumbh Mela held in the early decades of the 19th century, suggesting that the Sikh community did not seek to distance itself from the Hindu in the same way then as it may be attempting to now. Thus, communitarian fission as well as fusion characterize this process. An example of fusion, or as an example of fusion, one may refer to the Shaif tradition of South India, about which many scholars have argued that it looked upon itself as distinct from Hinduism or Hindu, quote unquote, in medieval times, but not any longer. I will now propose, on the basis of hints already dropped, that this negative principle of non-exclusion may be viewed as a positive principle of inclusion in the context of Hinduism. In order to create room for such a move, however, I would like to invoke some metaphors. 4 metaphors, to be precise. Let the first metaphor be that of a tree. The tree symbolizes organic growth And the fact that although its various branches and foliage are connected to the same trunk, they are of different shapes and sizes. But the sap, not visible to the bare eye, runs through them and is the same. Similarly, parts of it may be connected to other parts of it only indirectly. The branch at one end of the tree is connected to the branch at the other, but through the trunk. Those religions which are bound together by set beliefs and practices are like a bundle of twigs held together by a rope. By contrast, there is no such visible rope holding the tree together. The tree can keep growing. Note that Hinduism does not possess a fixed or closed canon. Hinduism then is more like a tree than a bundle of branches or twigs, and more like a banyan tree at that. The metaphor of a tree is helpful in another way. The famous Islamic mystic Rumi points out that one has to search through many leaves to get to the fruit of the tree. And perhaps to get to the fruits of Hinduism may take some doing. But let us hope that when we do get it, the fruit is not a forbidden one, as some have urged. Let the second metaphor be that of an encyclopedia. An encyclopedia sets out by intention to be comprehensive and to reflect the current state of the art. It has no preferences. It includes all items without judgment and describes them without judgment. It may offer judgments, quote unquote, by various scholars from various points of view within its covers. But it never delivers an exclusive judgment. It appears in successive editions, which try to keep abreast of new developments. Similarly, Hindu identity is not a thing. It is a process, and an encyclopedic process. Religions which clearly laid out doctrines and practices are like textbooks, easier to read and understand. An encyclopedia, by comparison, is more comprehensive and rich in information, but one must know how to consult it. This may also explain the role of the gurus, one of the role of the gurus in Hindu tradition. Which entry to look up? It is like an encyclopedia without being organized in that way. Of course, in some ways, Hinduism is not like an encyclopedia. Encyclopedias do not strive to integrate, although encyclopedic entries may attempt such an integration. As such, an encyclopedia is only a partial answer to the problem of compartmentalization. But Hinduism strives to integrate while also seeking to be not only adequate, but if possible abundant, embracing both infinity and infinitesimality. Encyclopedias are informational rather than transformational, whereas Hinduism ultimately aims at transformation. The third metaphor is one of contrast between an enclosure and a field. An enclosure has a clearly defined perimeter and a select point of entrance and exit. Those within it have a greater sense of distinction from those outside. By contrast, although a field may also have a point of some kind to let people in, people can often enter the field in other ways and even just wander in. The field may have its limits. It may fade out into a different terrain. But often, it is the other party's fence which constitutes its boundaries. This puts the finger on one big problem in defining Hinduism. It is affected by how others define themselves. In this sense, Hinduism is more like a field one might enter through any point, while other religions are more like an enclosure with a gate, at least arguably. This metaphor may also help us understand another statement about Hinduism, that it hopes to convert an empty mind into an open mind. The fourth metaphor is that of the circumference and the center. A center and a circumference can be related in two ways, unless one draws them simultaneously. One may first have a center and then draw a circumference around it. This represents the case of religions like Islam and Christianity, in which set doctrines and practices constitute the center, around which the followers form a circumference. Hinduism, by contrast, starts out with the circumference, with the people who claim to belong to it, and may then try to identify the center, or even centers. Religions such as Christianity and Islam expand in concentric circles. A religion like Hinduism too expands, but it expands first, and the contours of the new circumference determine the new center, or even centers. It can also be polycentric, with shifting or at least undulating circumference, with a shifting or an at least undulating circumference, depending on how one might wish to round off the circle. The metaphors chosen above by me might sound arbitrary. May I propose that their choice is random rather than arbitrary? For instance, the metaphor of the tree may be connected with the Ashwatha tree, already sacred in Harappan times and mentioned in the Kathopanishad and the Bhagavad Gita. The metaphor of the encyclopedia may be connected with the epic Mahabharata, which is quite explicit about its encyclopedic intentionality. The idea of a field is latent in the very first word of the very first verse of the Bhagavad Gita, Dharmakshetre, Kurukshetra, and which is found in all, while the idea of the circle can be connected with the swastika sign which it represents. The swastika sign is supposed to represent the globe, and which is found in all the three religions which constitute the Indic religious classical traditions, Hinduism, Buddhism, and Jainism. It also reminds us of a Christian hymn, "May the circle remain unbroken." We have now progressed from a negative to a positive statement of the Hindu phenomenon, from non-exclusivism to inclusivism. The argument can, however, be further refined by pointing out that the word inclusivism might carry with it a patronizing air, or indicate a kind of missionary zeal to absorb others. But the fact that Hinduism wishes to incorporate others as far as possible, without subsuming them in any way, enables us to move beyond the word inclusivism to pluralism, remembering all the while that such pluralism pertains to the areas of both doctrines and practices, as well as communities. Moreover, if it excludes nothing from the past, Hinduism has no founder, or from the future, Hinduism's canon has never been formally closed. And in the present, for while others may exclude themselves from it, it is not predisposed to exclude anyone. Perhaps, beg your pardon, people may pray apart from each other, or they may come together to do so. Right? People may pray apart from each other, or may come together to do so. even when they come together, they can do so in two ways. They can come together to pray, that is, retaining their identities. They can come together to pray, or they may come to pray together, dissolving their identity. Hinduism is open to all of these possibilities. A universal religion must provide room for sectarian differences as well as for rising above sectarian differences. But why is Hinduism non-exclusive or inclusive or pluralistic? Is it for some superficial reason, such as indifference or sheer lethargy or ennui? Or is it for a deeper reason? I would like to think that the reason is profound rather than superficial. No definition of Hinduism can be final, because within it, no religious or philosophical practice or point of view can be final, including this one. No definition of Hinduism can be final, because within it, no religious or philosophical practice or point of view can be final, including this one. This is where it probably goes beyond Buddhism, which is said to assert that the absolute truth is that there is no absolute truth. But back to Hinduism, the Hindu view that no position within it can be final, including this one, has two important implications for the present context. The philosophical implication is that no philosophical position can be final, including this one. Allows pluralism room for absolutism within it, and thus room within Hinduism for exclusivistic sects such as some forms of Vaishnavism, or even for claims of philosophical supremacy such as those sometimes made by Advaita Vedanta. Yet, such absolutism within it is a result of its own self-relativization. Whereas the absolutism of the Abrahamic religions, and I have especially Christianity and Islam in mind here, involves the relativization of others. Or, to put it another way, even its intolerance is an expression of its tolerance. Even the intolerance found within it is an expression of its tolerance, while even the tolerance displayed by most forms of Christianity and Islam could be a kind of intolerance which accepts other religions only as preparing the way for them, paving the way for their arrival into the Christian or Islamic fold, as it were. Other religions insist on making themselves the criterion. Hinduism is willing to be a sample along with others. It has even profounder consequences sociologically. For what this means is that since each individual member may follow one or more religion or sect periodically, or even at the same time, simultaneously, Hinduism can properly only be defined in terms of the people who are willing in principle to allow people within it to follow one or more than one such religion or sect at a time, and are also willing to allow those outside it to do so. Note that the possibility of adhering to only one religion or sect on one's part is included. It is not excluded from the possibility of following more than one religion at a time. What then becomes crucial is the willingness to be part of a religious world or community in which one freely allows this option of following only one religion to others, even if one is not exercising it oneself. I don't know how clear I was on that point. Now we are ready to discuss what Hinduism is all about. Hinduism is about providing every human being with access to all the possible modes of engaging the divine which human beings have come up with or will ever come up with, and about offering as complete and comprehensive a freedom of choice as is humanly, and shall we add, divinely possible. This constitutes to me the goal, the telos, the inner drive of Hinduism. In other words, to find out what Hinduism is, we have to graduate beyond such words as non-exclusivism, inclusivism, and pluralism to universalism. But such universalism of Hinduism possesses two dimensions. To make all possible religious modalities accessible to all. If one has a penchant for Buddhist vocabulary, what we have here may be called Sarvayan, not Hinyan, not Mahayan, not Vajrayan, but Sarvayan. Or in secular English usage, all in all. With the first all standing for the techniques and the second all for the people. Hinduism is also, however, a process of transforming all into whole, to the extent it might be possible. Or to phrase it in Hindu terms, of making Sarva into Vishwa. Now the question arises, if Hinduism is identical with such universalism, then why have Hinduism? Why not just universalism? The answer to this question runs, I think, as follows. While there may be a universal religion, it will not be found in a form which is universal. For then it would become uniform and cease to be universal in the genuine sense of the term, as containing rather than eliminating difference. Think of Krishna's epiphany in the 11th chapter of the Bhagavad Gita, if you will at this point. Everything is contained in this vision. It is not flattened out. Secondly, when we speak of universalism, we tend to think of it as a noun. Moreover, we tend to think of it as an abstract noun. However, let us try to think of it as a verb, as something dynamic. Hinduism then becomes not a universal fact, but a universalizing process. So although Hinduism and universalism are closely allied, the implicit self-understanding of Hinduism as a universalizing process keeps it distinct. That is why Hinduism does not speak of the world becoming Hindu so much as of a Hindu world. That is why the goal of a Chakravartin, the world conqueror in Hinduism, is to establish Hindu rule and not Hinduism over the world. Now we come to the subtlest point of all. It is my view that Hinduism involves a twofold universalizing process. It tries to offer salvation to all on their own terms, wherever they happen to find themselves. Even as it also tries to make all doctrines and practices available to them. At the same time, it also tries to improve the material and spiritual situation in which they find themselves. And it also tries to raise the empirical floor, even as it lifts one up to the spiritual ceiling. And this last point might be of surprising subtlety. So far as salvation or liberation or moksha is concerned, it seems to be an axiomatic assumption of Hinduism that one is free to choose freedom. That one is free to choose freedom at any time one so chooses. One is free to choose freedom at any time one so chooses. Can you think of any situation less hospitable for achieving salvation than a war and a battlefield? And this is precisely the situation in which the good news is delivered. One is free to choose freedom at any time one so chooses. That is to say, one is always free to choose freedom. Any empirical situation, no matter how bad or even evil, can provide the lift-off for salvation. It is like saying that one can travel to the moon from any given point on Earth in principle, even if it be in the middle of the ocean. By contrast, each exclusive religion thinks of itself as the Cape Canaveral, I say now Cape Kennedy, of rocket travel to the moon. But a point of even further subtlety is involved, and I run the risk of being misunderstood in making it. Hinduism is often accused of being a religion of the status quo. But the statement is true in a sense, not intended by those who make it. Hinduism is a religion of the status quo. Statement is true, I'm going to claim, in a sense, not intended by those who make it. Hinduism does claim that whatever your status, even a status quo in life, you can reach out to the divine from there. One is always free to choose freedom. All of life can really be yoga, in other words. It is for this reason and no other that fact and norm, description and idealization, statement and appeal seem inseparable in Hindu discourse at times. It does not say, however, that your status must be left as it is and your lot not improved. The Vaisheshik Sutra of Kanad famously defines dharma as that which enables one to rise in the world, abhyudaya, and which enables one to achieve salvation or liberation. Yato abhyudaya nishreya siddhi sadharma. And if you think that this is outside the mainstream of Hinduism, being Vaisheshika, the same sentiment is echoed in the Manusmriti, chapter 12, verse 88, for those who fancy it. I now wish to conclude, and for a lecture this long, the conclusion is going to be refreshingly brief. What is Hinduism after all? It is dharma. Dharma is what makes a thing what it is. It constitutes the law of its being. And I have tried to lay out before you what I think we have called Hinduism makes Hinduism what it is. But no European language, I am told, has succeeded in translating the term dharma successfully with a single synonym. Perhaps because the word contains a world within itself, the Hindu world as it were. The difficulty other languages and cultures have had in translating this word, even the Greeks had a problem with it. The Greek inscriptions of Ashoka mentioned piety, Eusebius, as the Greek word for dharma. His Aramaic inscriptions call it dhat, which means law. And the coins of Kanishka use the word dika, righteousness, for dharma. All this seems to suggest the semantic swath it cuts so uniquely is so uniquely Hindu as to make one feel secure in the belief that the word may indeed be used to define Hinduism. Although you might claim that all I have accomplished in the course of this long lecture is in the end to translate one indefinable word with another indefinable word. Please note, though, that while we may define Hinduism as dharma, we may not define dharma as Hinduism. And so, to end in the spirit of Swami Vivekananda, if we want to make Episcopalians better Episcopalians, and Methodists better Methodists, and if we want to make Christians better Christians, and Muslims better Muslims, and so on, then we have to become better Hindus. And for that to happen, we have to follow our dharma. Thank you.